On February 1st, 2026, at 1:47 in the morning, a masked figure approached an 84-year-old woman's front door in Tucson, Arizona. The doorbell camera mounted at her entrance recorded his arrival. Then, it went offline. The camera itself was never recovered from the scene. Neither was she. In this video, we reveal the most terrifying doorbell camera moments ever recorded. Section 1. Nancy Guthrie. The last evening Nancy Guthrie spent with her family was a game night. January 31st, 2026, a Saturday, at the Tucson home of her older daughter Annie and Annie's husband. It was the kind of evening that leaves no record worth keeping, nothing unusual to mention in the days that follow, nothing that anyone involved would think to write down. At 9:48 that night, the family drove her back to her own house. The garage door opened. At 9:50 it closed. The street outside was quiet. No cameras in the neighborhood logged unusual activity. No vehicles were seen moving slowly past the property. By every measure available to the people who would later try to reconstruct what happened, the evening ended normally. And then, sometime in the small hours of the following morning, it did not. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in Tucson for years, part of a large retired population drawn to the city by its dry climate, its winter light, and the particular quiet that the desert provides at the edges of daily life. The Sonoran Desert surrounds Tucson on all sides, and the city itself sits in a basin ringed by mountain ranges. The Catalina Mountains rise to the north. The Rincon Mountains rise to the east. The Santa Rita Mountains close off the southern horizon. It is enormous terrain, open and dry and difficult to search. Terrain that does not give much up once something is lost inside it. People who come to Tucson to retire come because the scale of the place suits a slower pace, because winter arrives gently, because the community of people living out the later chapters of their lives is deep-rooted and well-established. Nancy belonged to that community. She had a church she attended faithfully on Sunday mornings, a family she gathered with regularly for dinners and game nights, and a medical device implanted in her chest that connected wirelessly to an application on her phone and relayed data about her heart to a remote monitoring service. She was 84 years old and she was in good health, and she was, in every sense that matters when measuring a life against the thing that ended it, an ordinary woman living an ordinary retirement in a desert city. Her youngest daughter, Savannah Guthrie, had been a co-anchor of the NBC Today show for years and was one of the most recognized television broadcasters in the United States. That fact is relevant to this story in a specific way, and the nature of that relevance becomes clearer as the case develops. Nancy was not a public figure. She had no particular profile beyond her family, her church, and the neighborhood she moved through daily. She was not a person who would typically be identified as a target for anything. At 1:47 in the morning of February 1, the doorbell camera at the front of her house disconnected from its network. Residential doorbell cameras had become a standard feature of American homes over the course of the previous decade. Ring, which Amazon acquired in 2018, and Nest, which operates under Google, together account for the majority of the residential market. By the mid-2020s, tens of millions of these devices were installed on front doors across the United States, and the number was still growing. The premise of the technology is straightforward. The camera detects motion at the door, sends an alert to the owner's phone, and stores a video clip to cloud servers for review at any time. The homeowner can access the footage remotely from anywhere. Law enforcement can request it. If anything happens at the front of a house at any hour, there will be a record of it. That is the core promise. It is why people buy these devices, and it is the promise that the events at Nancy Guthrie's door tested directly. Nancy's camera was a Nest device. Whether it fulfilled its central purpose depended on a detail that many device owners do not fully understand until they need the footage and find it is not there. The clips that a doorbell camera generates are not stored indefinitely and not stored unconditionally. They are saved to cloud servers only if the account connected to the device has an active subscription plan. Different manufacturers use different terminology for these plans, but the structure is consistent across the major brands. With an active subscription, clips are saved, archived, and retrievable. Without one, the device can still detect motion and send a live alert to a phone, but no clip is saved. There is no archive. The moment passes and leaves no record. Nancy's subscription was not active. At 2:12 in the morning, the camera's software detected motion at the front of the house. The system logged that something was there. It sent no alert because the camera had been offline since 1:47. There was no clip because the subscription did not support clip storage. What remained in the system was a timestamp, a log entry noting that the sensor had registered a presence, and nothing more. At 2:28 in the morning, the application connected to Nancy's pacemaker showed that the device had moved out of range of her phone. The wireless connection these cardiac devices maintain with a paired phone requires proximity. When the app showed the link had dropped, it meant the phone and the pacemaker were no longer near each other. For investigators, that disconnection became a timestamp of its own. Within the 41-minute window between 1:47 and 2:28, something had happened at the front of Nancy Guthrie's house, and she had been removed from it. Nancy did not appear at church the following morning, which was a Sunday. Church-going was not an occasional habit for her. Members of her congregation noticed her absence because her absence was noticeable. They contacted her family. Her family went to the house around 11 o'clock that morning and spent time looking around before calling 911 at 12:03 in the afternoon. Deputies arrived at 12:15. Blood was found on the front porch of the house. DNA analysis run in the days that followed confirmed the blood matched Nancy Guthrie. The doorbell camera was not at the scene. Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County held a press conference on February 5th and updated the timeline investigators had pieced together. He described the camera disconnecting at 1:47. He described the motion detection at 2:12 with no accompanying footage. He described the pacemaker going offline at 2:28. He addressed the question of whether the device itself had been recovered. His phrasing was careful, but the implication was plain. Investigators had not located the camera and did not have it in their possession. It was gone from the property before the family arrived. Nanos also addressed footage recovery directly. Investigators had worked with a technology company to determine whether any video could be retrieved from the camera or from its connected cloud account. The company had run through its available methods. They had not succeeded. The sheriff used the word concerning. He then used the word disappointing. That answer might have closed the question of whether any visual record of the night existed. It did not. Cloud storage systems of the kind used by residential camera manufacturers operate according to principles that are poorly understood by most consumers, but well understood by data recovery specialists. When a subscription lapses and footage is designated for removal from cloud servers, the actual process of overwriting that data is rarely immediate and often takes considerable time. Video files flagged for deletion may remain in residual back-end storage while the system cycles through the process of writing over them. This is not a design flaw. It is simply how large-scale data storage infrastructure works. Researchers in consumer technology security had noted for years that there is a meaningful difference between what a company tells a customer about when footage is deleted and when that footage actually ceases to exist in any recoverable form on any server. The FBI entered the case alongside Pima County investigators and pursued exactly that distinction. Agents were able to retrieve footage from the Nest system's back-end cloud storage despite the device being described as offline and the subscription as inactive. The footage existed. It had not been fully cleared. The fact of its recovery received significant attention in the media and in technology circles, not only because of what the footage potentially showed, but because of what the recovery demonstrated about the gap between consumer understanding and technical reality. Millions of households have these devices. Millions of people believe that when a subscription lapses, footage is deleted, and when a device is disconnected, it stops transmitting. Neither of those things is entirely true in practice. The FBI released what it had recovered on February 10th. That date was the day after a second ransom deadline set by unidentified parties had passed. The footage showed a person approaching the front of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home in the early morning hours of February 1. The person was wearing a ski mask, gloves, and a backpack. A holstered firearm was visible. The footage showed that individual making direct contact with the camera, appearing to tamper with the device. The release of that footage represented the most significant piece of publicly available visual evidence in the case. It did not show a face. It did not show a vehicle with a legible plate. It showed a person who arrived prepared, who knew where the camera was, who had a plan for what to do with it, and who carried out that plan before leaving, with Nancy Guthrie and the camera both. 2 ransom notes were sent to media organizations in the weeks following the disappearance. Investigators analyzed each one for authenticity. The first addressed Savannah Guthrie by name. It demanded payment in United States dollars. What gave the letter some credibility in the eyes of investigators was its specificity. The note described a white smartwatch found on the floor near Nancy's bed and referenced damage to a floodlight in the backyard of the property. Neither detail had been made public at the time the letter arrived. Knowing them required direct knowledge of the inside of the house or the scene itself. The letter's focus on Savannah by name and its demand for American currency led investigators to conclude that whoever wrote it had selected this family deliberately. Nancy was taken because of her daughter. The person who took her had researched the family, identified Savannah's profile and financial standing, and targeted her mother with apparent precision. The second note shifted in tone entirely. It arrived while the second deadline was still approaching, and claimed that Nancy had died. Investigators evaluated that claim as they had evaluated the first letter. As of the time of this writing, no official agency has publicly confirmed Nancy Guthrie's death. Savannah Guthrie made multiple public appeals in the weeks following her mother's disappearance. She posted videos on social media asking directly for proof that Nancy was alive and stating that the family would pay to bring her home. In her first formal interview on the subject, given approximately 2 months after the disappearance, she told her former co-host Hoda Cope that she woke in the middle of the night every night and thought about what her mother had experienced. She said she had asked her brother whether it was possible that their family had been targeted because of her. He told her it might be. She described the weight of that possibility, the thought that her career and her public profile had drawn harm to her mother's door, as something that was too much to hold in her mind. The Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI continued releasing information through the first half of 2026. By mid-year, investigators had confirmed that the footage recovered from the camera's residual cloud storage may in fact document 2 separate visits to the property by the same individual, on 2 separate days before February 1. Authorities described these videos as critical to understanding the behavioral patterns and choices of the person who appeared in them. No suspect has been publicly named. No arrest has been announced. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. What the doorbell camera at the front of her home captured on the night she disappeared amounts to this: a log entry at 2:12 in the morning, noting that something was at the door, and, recovered separately through residual data, a masked figure making sure the device stopped watching. The camera was there to show whoever came to the door. The person who came to the door on the night of February 1 had thought carefully about that fact. They arrived in a mask. They approached the camera directly, and when they left, they took it with them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves inside the house. In December 2019, a nurse in Mississippi installed a camera in her daughter's bedroom so she could watch them sleep from her overnight hospital shifts. The youngest had a history of seizures, and the camera felt like a way to still be there. It was active for 4 days before someone else found their way into it. Section 2. Ashley LeMay. Black Friday of 2019 fell on November 29th. Ashley LeMay bought the Ring camera that day, drawn by a sale price and a recommendation from a friend who also had young children and spoke well of the device. LeMay was 27 years old, a nurse working overnight shifts at a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and the mother of 3 daughters. Her youngest, 4 years old, had a documented history of seizures. The camera was not a luxury purchase and not a matter of general home security. It was bought with a specific purpose: to allow LeMay to watch her daughters from a hospital ward in the middle of the night, to see that the 4-year-old was still breathing in her bed, and to speak to the children through the device's speaker if one of them woke and did not know where their mother was. She could tell them, without being there, that she was close. She could tell them to go back to sleep. The family lived in Nesbitt, a small community in DeSoto County, Mississippi, directly south of Memphis, across the state line. DeSoto County sits at the edge of the Memphis metropolitan area, the kind of place where the city's sprawl gives way to more residential space, quieter streets, a community of families with children in school, and parents working across the river. LeMay and her husband had the kind of domestic life that the camera was designed for: 2 adults managing a household, a child with a medical condition requiring monitoring, and work schedules that put distance between parent and home at the hours when the house was most quiet and the children were most vulnerable. She installed the camera in her daughter's bedroom. She set it up to monitor the room while she worked. 4 days after the installation, on the night of December 4th, a stranger accessed the device. Ring cameras, at the time of this incident, operated through an account-based system. A customer created an account with an email address and password, linked their device to that account, and thereafter accessed their camera through a mobile application. The system allowed for live viewing, recorded clips, 2-way audio, and remote monitoring. What it did not require at the time, despite repeated recommendations from security researchers, was 2-factor authentication. 2-factor authentication is the additional step that asks a user logging in from a new device or location to verify their identity through a secondary channel, typically a code sent to a phone number or email address. Without it, an account is protected only by its password. And a password, depending on where else it has been used and whether that other place has experienced a data breach, may not be protecting much at all. The method that allowed strangers to access Ring cameras in this period is known as credential stuffing. It does not require any technical sophistication in the conventional sense. It does not involve identifying a flaw in Ring's own servers or finding a backdoor into the system. It requires only a list of username and password combinations that were leaked in previous data breaches at other companies, and an automated tool that tries those combinations against Ring's login page at speed. Because people routinely use the same password across multiple online accounts, credentials exposed in a breach at one company will often work on accounts at another. If a person used the same email and password for their Ring account that they used for a streaming service that was breached, that combination would appear on the lists being circulated and tested. Their Ring account would open. In the period around December 2019, journalists covering technology security documented the existence of hacking forums where tools built specifically for testing Ring credentials were being discussed and shared openly. One publication obtained threads from multiple forums showing these tools available to anyone who knew where to look. Ring consistently maintained, in response to these reports, that its own systems had not been compromised, which was accurate. The breach was happening at the account level, not the server level. A homeowner whose account was accessed through a reused password had been let down not by Ring's infrastructure, but by the wider ecosystem of online security, and specifically by their own understandable practice of reusing credentials across platforms. That distinction matters for understanding how the technology works. It matters rather less to a family whose bedroom camera had been opened by a stranger. The night of December 4th, LeMay's husband was home. He heard something coming from the girl's room, a man's voice. He went to check. Whoever had accessed the camera left or went quiet before the situation could escalate in the way it would several nights later. The family was shaken enough to notice, but the full weight of what had happened did not yet land. On December 10th, LeMay was at work. Her daughters were in their bedroom. The eldest was 8 years old. At some point that evening, the camera's speaker activated, and a male voice began speaking to the girl. The voice told her it was Santa Claus. When the child asked who was there, the voice told her it was her best friend. The stranger asked whether she wanted to be his friend. The girl, alone in her room, screamed for her mother. The father, who was elsewhere in the house, heard her and came. By the time he reached the room and registered what was happening through the camera, the contact ended. LeMay learned what had happened from home while still at work. She described watching the footage from the hospital. The sound of an unknown adult male voice addressing her daughter in her own home, from a device she had installed to protect the child, registered in the way that a small number of experiences register. Not gradually, but all at once, as a complete rearrangement of what felt safe and what did not. She ran back to the house. The daughter who had been spoken to did not recover quickly from the incident. In the days that followed, she told her mother it was difficult to remember the camera was no longer there. She did not want to be in the room. She wanted to know who the person was and why he had called her a bad word at some point during the exchange, a detail that emerged separately from the initial reports. She and her sisters refused to sleep in their beds. LeMay later described the medical logic behind the installation to journalists. The youngest daughter's seizure history meant LeMay could not fully be at peace during night shifts, without visual confirmation that the child was safe. The camera was the solution to that anxiety. In the weeks after the hack, the solution was gone, and the anxiety had doubled, with a new specific fear added to the one the camera had been purchased to address. Ring's response to the incident, and to a cluster of similar incidents that became public around the same time, followed a consistent line. The company stated there was no evidence that its systems or network had been compromised. It announced new user privacy controls. It introduced an in-app feature called a control center, intended to serve as a centralized location where users could see and manage their security settings. It promoted two-factor authentication and began pushing users toward enabling it, though mandatory enrollment took longer to arrive. The core of the company's position was defensible in a narrow technical sense. The breach had not originated inside Ring. But the affected families had not purchased Ring on the understanding that their account security depended entirely on whether their email and password combination had been included in a breach at an unrelated company at some prior point in time. That was not the understanding the product was sold with. A class action lawsuit was filed against Ring following the cluster of incidents in December 2019. Legal complaints described the nature of the vulnerability, the harm to affected families, and Ring's failure to implement mandatory two-factor authentication prior to the incidents, despite security researchers having raised the issue. The specific harm the lawsuit centered on was not financial. Nothing had been stolen in the conventional sense. The harm was the access itself, strangers having been inside homes in the most intimate way available to someone at a distance, watching children sleep, watching them dress, able to speak to them and hear them respond. The legal standard for that kind of harm was something courts would need to assess, but the families involved did not need a legal framework to describe what it felt like. LeMay told journalists she believed the hacker was either someone who knew the family or someone physically nearby. She could not say why that feeling was so strong. It was just where her instincts went when she tried to make sense of it, the New York Times reported at the time. that at least 4 other families had experienced similar incidents, all involving strangers accessing Ring cameras and using the speaker function to interact with, or simply watch, children in their homes. A Georgia woman was asleep in her bedroom when a man's voice came through her Ring camera and told her to wake up. He told her he could see her in the bed. A family in Seattle reported a stranger had spoken to their 3-year-old through a baby monitor camera and told the child he loved them. These incidents were not identical in nature or severity, but they traced a common shape. A device installed to provide safety becoming the mechanism through which a stranger entered the most private spaces of a family's home. By the end of 2019, the scale of the credential stuffing problem affecting Ring accounts was significant enough that it had attracted federal attention and sustained press coverage. The gap between consumer understanding and technical reality was stark. Most buyers of a doorbell or indoor camera did not think in terms of credential databases, reused passwords, and automated login tools. They thought in terms of a device on their wall and an app on their phone, and a reasonable expectation that only they could see what the camera saw. The engineering reality behind that expectation was more fragile than the product experience suggested, and the gap between perception and reality was not something the marketing of these products did much to close. LeMay disconnected the camera and returned the device. Her youngest daughter's seizure history had not changed. The overnight shifts at the hospital had not changed. The need that had prompted the purchase in the first place was still there, unchanged, and now without a solution. She described to journalists what she imagined the stranger might have seen during the 4 days the camera was active before the intrusion became audible. The girls sleeping, changing, going about the private routines of a bedroom that children treat as the most personal space in a home, precisely because it is the space where adults are least present. She said she did not know what was seen. She said that not knowing was its own particular weight. No arrest was ever publicly announced in connection with the specific intrusion at the LeMay household. The incident remained, as it began, a case of an account accessed through credentials obtained somewhere else, a voice from somewhere unlocated, a stranger who spoke to a child in a darkened bedroom and was never identified. Ring implemented its privacy changes in the months that followed. The debate about mandatory two-factor authentication in consumer smart home products continued in technology policy circles for years. The LeMay daughters grew up. The youngest no longer seized in her sleep, with the frequency that had made the purchase feel necessary. The camera was gone, but the shape of the problem it had exposed stayed. Every Ring or Nest or equivalent device installed on a door or in a bedroom carries within it the same structural question. What is the account protected by? Who else might have those credentials? And what would someone do with the access if they got there? Most of the time, the answer to the last question is nothing. Most of the time, credential stuffing produces a useless account and a failed login and a session that ends without consequence. Most of the time, no one is in the bedroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section stays in 2019, but moves to a different kind of intrusion entirely. A man appeared on a family's doorbell camera in Fairfield, California, and what he said to the homeowner through the speaker will be the subject of several court hearings before this story reaches anything like an end. Section 3. Jason Nichols. Sometime around 9:30 in the morning on April 7, 2026, a man in a black trench coat and flip-flops appeared at the front door of a house on Burbank Court in Fairfield, California, and began pounding on it. The homeowner was not inside. He was somewhere else in the city, and the first indication he had that something was wrong at his house came through his phone, where the Ring doorbell app sent an alert that motion had been detected at the entrance. He opened the app. The camera was live. A man he did not recognize was standing on his porch, agitated and escalating, and the homeowner's pregnant wife and 5-year-old child were alone inside the house. Fairfield is a city of approximately 122,000 people in Solano County, sitting in the North Bay region of the San Francisco Bay Area. It occupies the stretch of California between the Bay and the Central Valley, a corridor of suburban communities that grew substantially in the decades when Bay Area housing prices pushed families eastward in search of more space. Burbank Court is a residential street in that city, the kind of address that exists in thousands of American communities. A block of houses with driveways and front lawns, and the particular calm of a weekday morning when working adults are gone and the street is mostly quiet. A trench coat and flip-flops on a porch at 9:30 in the morning is not something that street was built to absorb. The homeowner, watching through the app from wherever he was, activated the two-way audio function and spoke to the man through the doorbell speaker. The Ring system, like similar devices, allows this. The owner hears through the camera's microphone and speaks through its speaker. A remote conversation that sounds from outside the front door, like someone addressing a visitor from within the house. For the person at the door, there is no obvious visual confirmation that the homeowner is elsewhere. The voice comes from the device mounted beside the door. The house appears occupied, and the exchange unfolds as though the two parties are separated only by a wall. The man on the porch identified himself to the homeowner through that exchange. He said his name was Harry Dresden. The name belongs to a fictional character, specifically the protagonist of a long-running novel series called The Dresden Files, written by Jim Butcher, in which Harry Dresden is a professional wizard and private investigator operating out of Chicago. The character is known to readers of the series as a figure who combines supernatural authority with street-level toughness, someone who acts as a kind of enforcer of rules that ordinary people cannot perceive. Whether the man on the porch understood himself to actually be that character, or was using the name as a kind of declaration of intent, or was in a state where the distinction between those two things had collapsed, is something that investigators and prosecutors would later have reason to consider carefully. What is documented is that he spoke the name with apparent conviction, told the homeowner that the street was his neighborhood, and said through the speaker that he would end whoever was inside if the door was not opened. The homeowner did not open the door. He got in his car and began driving home. Inside the house, his wife knew what was happening. The nature of the Ring system means that multiple users can access the same camera's feed, and the sounds coming through the front door made the situation plain, regardless of what any app showed. She took her child to the garage and stayed there. The porch continued. The man in the trench coat moved through the full range of what the exterior of a house offers to someone who cannot get inside, but will not leave. He kicked the front door repeatedly. He grabbed a decorative chain attached to a mounted bell near the entrance and pulled it free from the wall. He used it to beat against the door. He smashed the Ring camera. He screamed at such volume and with such sustained force that his words became difficult to make out clearly on the recordings that survived. Throughout this period, he also continued to demand information about the homeowner's daughter. He asked, repeatedly and with escalating intensity, where the daughter was. He asked who was in there. He wanted to know where she was. Investigators later noted that he also entered the home and continued asking the same question while searching inside, moving through rooms and pulling open closet doors, while shouting variants of the same demand. The content of what he was saying combined with the totality of his behavior to create a situation that had no clear innocent explanation, and the question of what he believed he would find if he located the child, is one that the legal proceedings against him have not yet fully resolved. He could not break through the front door. The door held. He went around the property and found an alternate route inside, through a sliding glass door, and entered the house. At this point, the homeowner's wife and child were in the garage. The interior cameras, separate from the doorbell unit he had destroyed, continued recording as he moved through the house searching. He was inside for long enough to pull open multiple closets and continue his search before the homeowner arrived. What happened next is documented in outline, though the full visual record of the confrontation inside the house does not appear to have been made public in detail. The homeowner reached his property, armed himself with a garden shovel, and confronted the man who had entered his home. The two met somewhere inside or at the threshold. Both sustained head injuries. The physical exchange ended. Officers arrived and found Nichols near the home. He was taken into custody. The Fairfield Police Department named Jason Nichols, 30 years old, as the suspect, and charged him with a range of offenses. The formal charges included felony assault with a deadly weapon, first-degree burglary, making criminal threats with intent to terrorize, and vandalism. The burglary charge applied because of the manner of entry combined with the threatening conduct. The assault charge related to the confrontation with the homeowner and the shovel. The criminal threats charge addressed the sustained pattern of statements made through the doorbell speaker and at the front door, statements that had been recorded and were available in their specifics for prosecutors to examine. Nichols appeared in court for the first time on April 13th, less than a week after the incident. Reports from that appearance described his courtroom behavior as unusual. The proceedings attracted substantial media coverage, partly because footage from the doorbell camera and the interior cameras had circulated widely on social media in the days following the incident, and the specific quality of what those videos showed had generated an unusual level of public reaction. A man in a trench coat destroying a doorbell camera while claiming to be a fictional wizard, with documented evidence of him inside a family home searching for a child, lands in a category that is difficult to place. It is not a conventional burglary. It is not a conventional domestic incident. The combination of apparent derangement and focused intent, the coexistence of incoherent self-identification, with a very specific demand for a specific child, gave the case a texture that made it difficult to summarize briefly. A week after the first court appearance, prosecutors added a further charge tied to a separate incident that had occurred 2 days before the Burbank court home invasion. On April 5th, a witness had an encounter with Nichols that they did not initially connect to anything requiring police involvement. After the viral spread of the doorbell footage, that witness came forward. The resulting charge was filed under a California statute addressing annoying or molesting a child under the age of 18. The second incident involved a different child. Nichols's bail was raised to $60,000 following the addition of that charge. The Fairfield Police Department confirmed that the April 5th incident involved a child who was not connected to the family on Burbank Court. The question of who Jason Nichols is and how he arrived on that porch on that morning is one the proceedings will eventually address in more detail than the public record currently contains. What is known from the documents and statements available is that he was 30 years old at the time of the incident. He was living in Fairfield, and his behavior on April 7 combined what appears to have been genuine psychological disturbance with specific physical acts that caused documented harm. The fictional identity he invoked, Harry Dresden, is not an obscure reference. The Dresden Files series comprises more than 20 novels and has sold tens of millions of copies. It has a significant dedicated readership. Whether Nichols was a reader of the series, or knew the name from some other source, or had constructed some particular relationship to the character and the authority the character is described as wielding in his fictional world, is not something the available public record settles. The homeowner's wife and child were not physically harmed during the incident. The homeowner sustained a head injury in the confrontation. The 5-year-old was in the garage with the mother throughout the period when Nichols was inside the house. The camera he destroyed on the front porch had already captured several minutes of footage before it was smashed, and the interior cameras continued operating after the doorbell unit went down. The record of what happened on Burbank Court on the morning of April 7th is, therefore, substantially intact. There is a specific detail about the homeowner's experience that the available reporting does not linger on, but that sits at the center of what made the incident particularly difficult to absorb. He was watching his home being invaded in real time through an application on his phone. He could see what was happening. He could hear it. He could speak through the camera and hear the response. He could start his car and drive toward his house. He could not do anything to slow or stop what was unfolding on the screen in his hand during the minutes it took him to get there. The doorbell camera delivered exactly what it was designed to deliver. It provided real-time visual access to what was happening at the entrance to his home. The access itself, in that situation, was its own particular kind of torment, a clear picture of something he could not reach. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section travels north to Washington State, where a doorbell camera captured something far quieter than what happened in Fairfield. A man picking up his children for a Friday evening visit. Nothing about it, on film, looked wrong at all. Section 4. Travis Decker. Whitney Decker walked into the Wenatchee Police Department lobby after 8:30 on the evening of May 30th, 2025, to report that her 3 daughters had not come home. The parenting arrangement required Travis Decker to return the girls by 8 o'clock every Friday. He had never been late. What pushed her through the door, rather than waiting another hour, was that his phone was going straight to voicemail. She told the detective who took her report that he was currently experiencing mental health difficulties. She said he always communicated when something changed. The absence of any communication was itself the thing that told her something was wrong. Peyton was 9 years old. Evelyn was 8. Olivia was 5. Peyton was old enough to carry a personality that the people around her could describe in specific terms. A child who could hold a conversation and understand what was happening in a room. Evelyn occupied the middle position in the family, the bridge between the eldest and the youngest, in the way that middle children fill that particular role. Olivia was 5, young enough that the world was primarily what the adults closest to her made it. Whitney described all 3 of her daughters publicly, in the period after their bodies were found, as having warm and open hearts. She said it with the precision of someone describing people they had known completely, to an audience that would never know them at all. Travis Decker had served as an infantryman in the United States Army from March 2013 to July 2021. 8 years of service that included a 4-month deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. The skills that role develops are specific and documented: land navigation, fieldcraft, physical endurance under sustained conditions, the capacity to function with limited resources in terrain that demands careful management of every variable. Beyond the formal military component, Decker had a personal history with extended wilderness living that went further than his training. At some prior point, he had spent more than 2 months in remote backcountry, off the grid, alone, largely self-sufficient. Whitney had included that fact in a legal petition she filed seeking to restrict his overnight visits with the girls. She had described a man capable of surviving extended periods in wilderness with minimal equipment. The petition also noted he had been living out of his pickup truck. A court had been reviewing the parenting arrangement when May 30th arrived. None of that background was known to the officer who took the report on Friday evening. By the time it was fully assembled and understood, it had changed every operational decision the search would make. Decker collected the girls at 5 o'clock on May 30th. A camera at a nearby location captured his truck leaving and heading toward Leavenworth at approximately 6 in the evening. Leavenworth is a small tourist town built around a Bavarian-themed commercial district at the foot of the Cascade Mountains, a destination that draws visitors through the warmer months. The Rock Island campground sits along the Columbia River in that area. His truck was found there on June 2nd, 3 days after he had failed to return the children. The girls were found nearby. The autopsies established that Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia had been suffocated. Their wrists were bound with zip ties. The medical examiner placed their time of death at the evening of May 30th, the same evening they had gone to their father's truck at 5 o'clock, for what their mother had understood to be a standard Friday visit. They had been with him for hours. They did not survive the night. The specific weight of what the zip ties indicate requires a moment. Suffocation as a cause of death does not require any implement. It requires proximity and time. The zip ties around the wrists of 3 small children indicate that restraint was applied, that the children were prevented from using their hands, which means that before they died they were bound, and they knew it. The oldest was 9 years old. What she understood about the situation she was in, and what the 8-year-old understood, and what the 5-year-old understood, is not something the autopsy reports address or could address, because understanding is not a forensic finding. The zip ties are the Chelan County Sheriff's Office, the Wenatchee Police Department, the FBI, the United States Marshals Service, and multiple state and local agencies assembled the manhunt that began after the truck and the girls were found on June 2nd. Sheriff Mike Morrison later summarized the geographic reality of the search in a single figure. Chelan County covers more than 2,900 square miles, and 87% of it is not accessible by road. The Cascade Mountains that define the western edge of the county are not difficult terrain in the sense of requiring special equipment or experience. They are difficult terrain in the sense that a person who knows how to move through them and wants not to be found will not be found quickly by people looking from roads and trails. Morrison said investigators went to the FBI and asked for a blank check on resources. The answer was yes. Whatever was needed was made available. The search became the largest manhunt in the recorded history of Chelan County. What they were looking for was a man who had prepared for being looked for, in terrain he understood well, and had deliberately used before, having placed supplies in wooded areas near the initial search zone before May 30. The caches, discovered by search teams in the early days of the manhunt, established that the planning predated the crime. The supplies had been put there before he drove to collect the girls. He had known what he intended to do after he drove to Leavenworth, and he had done something about that knowledge in advance. The doorbell camera footage that the Chelan County Sheriff's Office released in the first week of June had been captured at addresses Decker had visited in the days immediately before May 30. Investigators described it as documenting his movements and demeanor during the period they were trying to map, and they described one specific clip as showing what they believed was his last confirmed public appearance before he went into the wilderness. The footage was released alongside photographs and a public request for help identifying his location, aimed at anyone who might recognize a face or a vehicle or a detail that corresponded to something they had seen. What the footage showed was a man going about what appeared to be ordinary activity. This is the specific and unresolvable difficulty of surveillance footage, as a record of the days before a serious crime. A camera captures surface behavior. It captures movement, clothing, direction of travel. It records that a specific person was at a specific address at a specific time. What it cannot do is reach past the surface into whatever is being planned. Whatever decision has already been made and is simply waiting for its execution. The man in the doorbell footage was behaving in ways consistent with any person going about their days in a small city in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. He was visible, recorded, fully in frame. He was also, at the time those clips were made, already past the point at which any external intervention would have changed what happened to Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia on the evening of May 30. Whether the decision had been made days before, weeks before, or at some specific moment during the drive toward Leavenworth, is not something the footage, or any other available evidence, conclusively establishes. On May 27th, 3 days before the Friday visit, Decker had been involved in a minor vehicle collision in a Safeway parking lot in Wenatchee. Police responded and interacted with him. Body cam footage from that encounter was later released. It showed a man who was, to the officers responding to a routine traffic matter, entirely unremarkable. There was no basis for further action. They completed the report and left. Decker remained in the parking lot and then drove away in the truck that would be found at a campground 72 hours later, with the bodies of his daughters nearby. The encounter on May 27th is one of the most difficult elements of the case to sit with, not because of anything unusual about how the officers handled it, but because of its ordinariness. Two police officers spoke with Travis Decker 3 days before his daughters died at his hands, in a parking lot, about a minor collision, and there was nothing in that conversation that produced any cause for concern. Traffic incidents happen constantly. The body cam records them constantly. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be. This one was a man in a parking lot on a Tuesday, and the body cam captured a man in a parking lot on a Tuesday, and the officers who had that conversation with him had no way to know that on Friday he would put his daughters in the truck and drive toward the mountains and not bring them back. In early July, a family camping in the Bear Creek area of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho reported seeing a man consistent with Decker's description. A white male with a long ponytail and an overgrown beard, carrying a black backpack, wearing a black cap and dark clothing, and a Garmin-style watch. The United States Marshals, Greater Idaho Fugitive Task Force, investigated the tip. Decker had not been found near the campground where his truck was discovered, which was in Washington state, and the Sawtooth National Forest is across the state line in Idaho, a significant distance under any calculation. But a man with more than 2 months of demonstrated backcountry survival capability, traveling on foot through remote terrain over the course of 5 weeks from a known starting point, was not automatically an impossible subject for a sighting that far afield. The tip was taken seriously and investigated. It did not produce an apprehension. The summer search generated periodic updates but no capture. Morrison and other officials held briefings that did not minimize what they were dealing with. They were looking for someone who had trained for this, had planned for this, and had gone into terrain he had chosen specifically because he understood it, and they would not find him in it quickly. The aerial assets covered thousands of square miles of watershed and ridgeline. The ground teams moved through valley bottoms and along drainage corridors. The K-9 units worked the areas where the caches had been found, and the areas around the campground where the truck had been located. None of it produced a confirmed location. The public request that investigators made during this period acknowledged something specific about how residential camera networks function in rural fugitive searches. People across northwestern Washington and into western New York were asked to review their own doorbell and surveillance footage, not just current alerts but archived clips from recent nights, specifically the hours between midnight and dawn. A man moving through the perimeter of a rural community at 3 in the morning, crossing a property line or moving along a road past a house with a mounted camera, would not have triggered a call to police because no one would have been awake to see it happen. The footage would be in the cloud storage connected to that account, recorded automatically, waiting for someone to open the application and look. The request was for people to do exactly that, to go back through the nighttime clips from recent weeks and look for anything that corresponded to a man on foot moving through a residential area at an hour when foot traffic is essentially absent. The request was a recognition that the camera network that had accumulated across American residential properties was not only a tool for documenting what happened at front doors, it was a tool for documenting what happened in front of houses, on the roads beside them, at the edges of driveways and yards, at any hour, regardless of whether anyone was awake to notice. The footage existed independent of its owner's awareness of what it contained. Millions of clips are generated and stored and never reviewed, because nothing in them requires review. Investigators were asking people to look at the clips that had been generated during the hours most likely to contain what they were looking for. Whitney Decker's account of the weeks after the girls were found, in the limited public record of her statements, does not describe a person who found any of the investigative developments or the scale of the search response sufficient to address what had happened. Her daughters had gone to their father's truck at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon for a visit that was supposed to end by 8, and they had died before midnight on the same day, and she had walked into a police lobby to report them missing because his phone was going to voicemail. Between those two facts, the Friday evening report and the June 2nd discovery of the bodies, there was a gap of 3 days during which the investigation was still treating the situation as a missing persons case, working through the information available, building toward the campground, toward the truck, toward what was found near it. The search ended on September 25, 2025, when the Chelan County Sheriff's Office announced that human remains found in a remote part of the county had been positively identified through DNA analysis from the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab as those of Travis Caleb Decker. Clothing recovered at the scene was consistent with what he had been wearing when he was last documented. The manner of his death was not definitively established from the physical evidence available. The terrain in which his remains were found had not preserved the circumstances of how he had come to be there. He had gone into the Cascade Wilderness on the evening of May 30, after leaving the campground, and he had not come out alive. And the search that had spanned nearly 4 months across 2,900 square miles of county, in which 87% of the land has no road access, had ended not with a capture, but with a confirmation. Morrison spoke to Whitney Decker directly at the press conference. He said he was sorry for how long it had taken. The apology was specific and public, directed at a person who had walked into a police lobby on a Friday evening and had spent the following 4 months in a position that no accounting of the search's difficulty or scale could meaningfully address. The 3 girls with warm and open hearts had been found at a campground in early June. Their father had been found in the mountains in late September. The doorbell camera footage released in the early days of the search had documented the last confirmed ordinary moments of a man who had already decided what he was going to do, moving through the visible surface of his days in the small city at the foot of the mountains, passing in front of cameras that recorded him precisely and understood nothing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves to the first morning of 2020, where a Nest camera on a stranger's front door recorded a woman running to it in the dark, screaming for help. No one was home. But the footage was already uploading, and inside it was a single word that put a name to the man before sunrise. Section 5. Darnell Rogers. At 12:48 in the morning on January 1st, 2020, a woman ran to the front door of a house that did not belong to her and began pounding on it. She was crying. She was audible on the Nest doorbell camera, recording her from the mounted position beside the door, and the things she was saying were clear enough on the audio track to matter later, in ways she could not have known at the time. She was saying stop. She was saying no. She was directing these words behind her, back toward the street, at the man who had gotten out of the white sedan and was already running in her direction. The house belonged to a family who was not home. They had gone out for New Year's Eve, as much of their neighborhood had, and the Nest camera on their front door was active and connected to their account, and transmitting to cloud storage in the way that these devices transmit continuously when they are running. The moment the camera detected motion, it sent an alert to the homeowner's phone. Somewhere away from the house, one of the homeowners received that alert, opened the application, and looked at what the camera was showing. They watched what happened next. Then they called the police and sent the footage directly to investigators. What the camera showed was Darnell Rogers reaching Taryn Couillard at the front door of a stranger's house and grabbing her. He threw her to the ground. He kicked her with enough force that she tumbled down the front step of the porch. She attempted to resist. He continued. He dragged her by the hair back toward the car. The entire sequence was recorded by the camera belonging to a family who was not home, on a block in a neighborhood south of downtown Las Vegas, near the intersection of Warm Springs Road and Interstate 215, at 12 minutes to 1 in the morning on the first day of a new year. During the assault, she said his name. She said Darnell, audibly enough that it survived the compression and the ambient noise of the audio track, and was identifiable when investigators listened to the recording. That word became the first and most important investigative lead the footage contained, because it was a name attached to a face in a video in the possession of a police department that now had both, and the combination of the two is what moves an investigation from unknown subject to named suspect in the shortest possible time. Captain Dennis O'Brien of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department described what the footage provided at the press conference where he announced the arrest. He said it simply. They had a name. The recording had given it to them. A woman being dragged by her hair across a stranger's front steps in the early hours of New Year's Day had cried out the name of the man doing it, and the camera had stored that cry in a cloud server, and the homeowner had sent the footage to police, and the name was now in the investigation as a lead that could be run against records and calls and tips from people who might know who Darnell was. Rogers was 23 years old. He had 3 outstanding warrants at the time this happened, warrants connected to prior incidents that had not yet produced an arrest. He and Couillard had spent New Year's Eve together. They had attended a party and were in the car on the way back when the argument began. Couillard was driving. She stopped the car. She got out and ran toward the nearest house that had lights, the nearest door that might open, and the Nest camera on that door recorded her running and recorded what followed. The car also contained a 1-month-old child. The baby was Rogers's child as well as Couillard's. When she got out of the car and ran, the infant remained in the back seat. This detail arrived in the reporting of the case as a secondary fact, something that the initial coverage noted and moved past. But it sits at the center of what the camera actually documented. A woman running from a stopped car in the early hours of New Year's morning. A man following and catching her at a stranger's door. And in the car they had both just left. A baby 1 month old, in the dark, in a vehicle on a residential street, while the assault was recorded, and the footage was uploading to a server, and the homeowner was somewhere across the city, opening their phone to see what the camera had caught. Police in a different area command received a 911 call at approximately 3:45 in the morning, reporting a domestic dispute between a woman and her boyfriend. The name given was Darnell. The description of the man in the call was consistent with the footage. A unit was already moving. Rogers was arrested without incident near Cyrus Avenue and Arville Street at approximately 3 in the morning on January 2nd, less than 3 hours after the camera had recorded what it recorded. Couillard was located and confirmed to be safe. Child Protective Services became involved in the case in connection with the infant who had been left in the car. The footage was released publicly by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department on January 1, which was the same day as the assault and the same day the homeowner had forwarded it. The decision to release it served two simultaneous functions. The first was investigative. Police needed tips from anyone who could identify the man in the video or provide information about the woman's location, since at the time of release, she had not yet been confirmed safe. The second was the function that compelling footage always serves, regardless of investigative intent, which is to generate attention at a scale that formal channels cannot produce. The footage circulated widely and fast. It had been viewed by an audience far beyond the Las Vegas television market before Rogers was arrested. The viewing of that footage by a large and geographically dispersed audience was what produced the tip that connected a patrol call in a different area command to the man in the video. Someone who had seen the footage recognized the face or the name or some detail of the car, and their recognition became information that moved through whatever channel it moved through, until it reached the officers already responding to the 3:45 domestic disturbance call, where the name Darnell was already in the report. The arrest happened at 3 in the morning because the footage was released at a time when enough people were still awake and connected to their phones that recognition was possible, and the tip came through in time to matter. Couillard's father later described her injuries at the sentencing hearing, with the specific vocabulary of a parent who has looked at physical harm done to their child and cannot stop seeing it. He said he had never in his life seen someone bruised so thoroughly. He said the bruising ran from her legs to her head to her back. He was describing a body that had been kicked and dragged and grabbed across the surface area that the camera had captured in a clip, lasting under 5 minutes, and he was describing it almost 2 years after the footage had circulated across the internet. Because the legal process between the arrest and the sentencing took nearly 2 years to reach its conclusion. Rogers told police after his arrest that he did not clearly remember what the argument had been about. He said he thought it was money. He said he had been drinking. He was initially charged with first-degree kidnapping and battery constituting domestic violence. His bail was set at $50,000 at his first court appearance. He entered a not guilty plea, and the case moved through the pretrial process over the following months. The plea that resolved the case was entered in October 2021. Rogers pleaded guilty to 1 count of coercion and 1 count of battery domestic violence. The first-degree kidnapping charge that had defined the early coverage was not the charge he was sentenced on. In December 2021, District Judge Ronald Israel heard from 2 people before deciding the sentence. One of them was Robert Couillard, Taryn's father. The other was Taryn Couillard herself. Taryn Couillard asked the judge for leniency. She told him she did not believe prison time would serve any useful purpose in the situation. She said Rogers was a changed man. She noted that they were co-parenting a toddler and that incarceration would complicate the family structure she was trying to maintain for her child. Her father asked for consequences. He said consequences needed to attach to actions for anything meaningful to follow. The judge held both of these positions and sentenced Rogers to 3 years of probation, with a provision that violations of the probation terms could result in 2 to 5 years in custody. The legal outcome generated a cycle of public commentary that focused primarily on the gap between what the footage showed and what the sentence produced. That gap is not unfamiliar to anyone who has followed domestic violence cases through the American legal system with any sustained attention. The specific dynamics of intimate partner violence, the economic dependencies and emotional ties that bind people together after serious harm has occurred, the ways those ties shape a victim's decisions about what she wants the legal process to do on her behalf. These produce outcomes that appear inconsistent when viewed only through the lens of the camera footage. The camera captured 4 minutes and 53 seconds of a specific night. It captured the physical mechanics of one event. It did not capture the 18 months that followed, the conversations between Couillard and Rogers, the co-parenting of a child who was 1 month old on the night the footage was made, and was approaching 2 years old by the time the sentencing hearing took place. The calculation Couillard had made about what she needed her life to look like, and what the sentencing options available to the court could and could not contribute to that. Courts are asked to account for all of those things, not only the footage. The footage is evidence of what happened at a specific place at a specific time. It is not a complete account of the relationship, the aftermath, or the choices available to everyone involved. Judges make sentencing decisions in the presence of those limitations. Rogers left the courthouse without serving time. The family whose camera had made all of this possible was not named in the coverage. The house on Little Sydney Drive was identified as a location, but the homeowners who had been out for New Year's Eve, who had received an alert on their phone and opened the feed and watched what the camera was showing, were not identified publicly. What they had done was exactly what the technology asks of the people who install it. They had seen the alert, they had looked at the feed, they had called the police and forwarded the footage in the early hours of January 1, before they knew whether the woman they had just watched being dragged to a car was safe or not. The camera had been there because they had put it there, for reasons that presumably had nothing to do with capturing a domestic assault on the first morning of a new year. It had been pointed at their front steps because front steps are where these cameras go, and the world outside a residential front door contains whatever it contains on any given night, and the camera records it regardless. Couillard had screamed the name of the man harming her in the direction of a door that no one answered. No one answered because no one was home. The door stayed shut. The camera stayed on. Her voice and his name were already in the cloud before the sedan left the block, and by 3 in the morning the arrest had been made, and the infant was no longer in the back seat of a car on a January street, and the footage that would shape the next 2 years of two people's lives was in the possession of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, preserved and time-stamped and exactly as clear as the moment it had been made. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section stays with the domestic space but moves from a camera on a stranger's porch to a camera installed inside a home by the person who would be harmed by it. In Bonneville County, Idaho, a woman discovered that the device she had tried to disable was still watching. Section 6. David Axinelli. A deputy from the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office arrived at the woman's home in May 2020 in response to her report that 2 individuals she believed to be connected to David Moises Axinelli had appeared outside. She had placed the tape there herself, over a camera she no longer trusted. After changing the router password had not solved the problem of the device activating in ways she had not caused. The deputy stepped onto the porch. Then a voice came through the camera's speaker. It was Axinelli, watching through the device she had tried to cover and disable. Speaking directly to the officer standing outside the home the court had ordered him to stay away from. The woman had a history with David Moises Axinelli, 42 years old, that had ended badly enough to require legal intervention. Axinelli had previously lived at her residence. The relationship had deteriorated to a point where she had gone to court and obtained a civil protection order requiring him to stay away from her. A civil protection order is not a criminal conviction. It is a civil legal instrument that defines a boundary and specifies that crossing it constitutes a legal violation. It is the mechanism the civil court system provides to people who have documented reason to believe that a specific individual poses a risk to their safety. It requires that the person applying for it go before a judge, present evidence of that risk, and receive formal legal confirmation that the boundary is warranted. She had done that. The order was in place. She had also taken practical steps beyond the legal one. At some point after the relationship ended, and the order was obtained, she noticed the doorbell camera at her entrance had been activating in ways that she had not caused. The camera was responding to something. It was motion activated in the normal sense, but the activations she was observing did not correspond to anything she could see. She became concerned that the device was being accessed remotely. Her brother, who was helping her manage the situation, changed the password to the home's wireless router. Changing the router password forces any device connected to that network to re-authenticate, which in practical terms means that anyone accessing the camera remotely through the network connection would lose that access unless they had the new credentials. The camera would need to be reconnected to the network with the updated password before its live feed could be reached from outside the house. She believed this had addressed the problem. She also placed a piece of tape over the camera's lens. The tape was a simple physical solution to a technical problem she did not fully understand and could not entirely control. The lens was covered. Whatever the camera might be transmitting, it could not transmit an image through a piece of tape. It was the kind of solution that a person arrives at when the technological complexity of the underlying problem exceeds what they can confidently address through the device's own settings. She could not be fully certain what access remained, what data was being processed, what remote connections the device might maintain independent of its video feed. The tape was what she could do. She put it there and she left it there. On May 16, 2020, she contacted the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office. Two people she believed to be associates of Actionelli had appeared outside her door. That appearance, in the context of the existing protection order and everything that had preceded it, was alarming enough to warrant a call to police. When the deputy arrived and approached her residence, the piece of tape that she had placed over the doorbell camera was no longer on the lens. It had been removed. Someone had been at her front door, close enough to the device to take the tape off, at some point before the deputy got there. Whether that had happened minutes before or days before was not immediately clear. The deputy stepped onto the porch and prepared to speak with the woman inside. The doorbell camera spoke first. Actionelli's voice came through the device's speaker. He was somewhere else, somewhere remote from the house, and he was watching through the camera that the woman had tried to disable and that her brother had tried to lock out of the network by changing the router password. He could see the deputy on the porch. He addressed the deputy directly. He told the deputy what he believed he had observed through the camera at an earlier point, specifically that he thought he had seen another man at the residence, a man the woman had also filed a civil protection order against. He was offering this information as though his access to the camera were unremarkable, as though watching the front of a home from which he had been legally excluded were simply a thing he had the standing to do. The deputy was now standing on the porch of a home, having arrived to assist a woman who had reported a threatening situation connected to a specific individual, while that same individual spoke to the deputy through the camera mounted beside the door. The camera's speaker and microphone made the exchange technically possible. Actionelli could hear the deputy, see the deputy, and respond. The physical distance between them was irrelevant to the device. The question that the subsequent investigation needed to answer was how Actionelli retained access to the camera after the router password had been changed. The probable cause affidavit filed in connection with the case addressed this directly. The brother's account of changing the password was clear. He had updated it after the woman first noticed unusual activity from the device, with the specific purpose of cutting off any remote access that Actionelli might have. For Actionelli to continue accessing the camera after that change, he would have needed either the new password, which would require someone inside the household to have provided it, or physical access to the router itself. Physical access to a router allows a person to perform a factory reset, which returns the device to its default settings and allows it to be reconfigured from scratch, potentially with the original or a new network name and password that the unauthorized party controls. The affidavit noted that Actionelli himself indicated, during his exchange with the deputy, that he had been accessing the camera. It did not specify, or the public record does not fully preserve, exactly how he explained the method. What the affidavit established was sufficient for a first-degree stalking charge. Idaho's stalking statute covers a range of conduct, but its most serious form requires a course of conduct directed at a specific person that causes that person reasonable fear, and that occurs in violation of a court order or involves certain categories of aggravated behavior. The protection order was in place. The conduct of remotely accessing a camera to maintain surveillance over the person named in that order, appearing to have interfered with the physical device by removing the tape she had placed on it, and appearing at the property through associates while conducting that surveillance, constituted the kind of pattern the statute addresses. First-degree stalking in Idaho carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. His bond was set at $50,000. A no-contact order was issued between the two parties. The deputy's recommendation to the woman was specific. She was advised to get a new phone on a new plan, severing the connection between her current number and whatever accounts or services were linked to it. She was advised to have the doorbell camera removed from the property entirely and to preserve it as evidence, since the device itself and the access logs associated with its account might contain information relevant to the investigation. The camera that had been meant to show her who was at her door had instead been used to watch her home from outside, to track who visited, to maintain a form of presence at a property the law required Actionelli to stay away from. The specific mechanics of how smart home devices retain access data are worth understanding in the context of what happened here, because the vulnerability that Actionelli appears to have exploited is not unique to this case. When two people share a living space, and one of them sets up a smart home device, the device is registered to an account with credentials that both people may know. When the relationship ends and one person leaves, the account itself does not automatically change. The person who leaves may retain the login information for the account. They may retain it on their phone, stored in an application they continue to carry. The router password can be changed, and the camera can be removed from the network. But if the account itself remains accessible to the departing person, They may be able to reconfigure the device's connection through the account interface without ever entering the physical space. If the device is physically accessible, there are additional methods. The combination of account-level access and potential physical access to networking equipment creates a situation where a determined person with prior knowledge of the home's setup can maintain surveillance capabilities that are not visible to the person being watched. This is the version of smart home security risk that receives less attention than the credential stuffing attacks or the hacking of cameras by strangers. It is the risk that exists not at the perimeter of the relationship between a homeowner and a faceless remote attacker, but inside the history of a relationship that has ended. The person most likely to know how a home's devices are configured, what the account passwords are, what the router credentials were before they were changed, and where the physical networking equipment is located in the house, is someone who used to live there. The protection order that defines where that person can and cannot physically go does not follow them into the app on their phone. The woman in Bonneville County had tried to address the problem using the tools available to her. She had obtained the legal protection the courts offered. She had changed the router password. She had put tape over the lens. Each of these steps was reasonable, given what she knew and what she had access to. None of them held. The legal instrument defined a physical boundary that Axanelli did not need to cross because the technology provided an alternative. The router password was either obtained by other means or circumvented through physical access to the device at a time she was not aware of. The tape had been removed, probably not remotely, which meant someone had been close enough to the door to take it off. When the deputy arrived on her porch that May morning in Idaho Falls, and the voice came through the speaker, what it demonstrated was not a sophisticated cyber attack or an unusual technical exploit. It demonstrated that a device registered to a shared account, installed in a home that had once been shared, could be retained as a means of surveillance by the person who no longer had the legal right to be there. The camera had not been hacked by a stranger. It had been kept by someone who had once been familiar. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves to the early morning hours of a December night in Surprise, Arizona, where a homeowner received an alert from his Ring camera and assumed it was an Amazon package. When he opened the live feed, someone was already on his porch. They were not delivering anything. Section 7. Justin Windjam. William Sanders opened his phone expecting to see an Amazon package. The Ring camera at his front door had sent a motion alert on December 22, 2022, 3 days before Christmas, and in the experience of most doorbell camera owners, that alert means a delivery driver has left something on the porch and walked back to a van. The live feed showed a man in a red hoodie covering the lens with his hand, then pouring something across the entrance, then setting it on fire. Sanders watched his front porch catch fire on his phone screen from somewhere across the city where he was not. The neighborhood near Greenway Road and Bullard Avenue where William Sanders lived was that kind of place. The homes were not old. The trees along the verges had not yet grown to full canopy. The streets were quiet in the way that relatively new residential streets are quiet, lacking the density of foot traffic that older urban neighborhoods generate. On December 22, 2022, 3 days before Christmas, Sanders was not home. He was somewhere else in the city, in the way that people on December 22 are frequently somewhere else, managing the particular logistics of the days immediately before a holiday. His house was unoccupied. The Ring doorbell camera on his front entrance was active, connected to his account and transmitting to cloud storage in real time. The alert arrived on his phone with the specificity of motion detection. Something was at the front of the house. Sanders opened the live feed because he was, as he later told reporters, expecting an Amazon package. The framing of that expectation matters because of how universal it is, how thoroughly the alert-then-check reflex has become associated, in the experience of doorbell camera owners, with the routine arrival of deliveries. The camera fires, the phone buzzes, the homeowner opens the feed for the 2 seconds it takes to confirm that a driver has set a box on the porch and walked back to a van. The habit of looking is so deeply conditioned by the frequency of that outcome that the moment when the feed shows something else carries a specific quality of wrongness, a half second during which the brain is still processing the image against the expectation it arrived with. What Sanders saw on his phone screen was a man in a red hoodie on his porch. The man was not carrying a package. He moved to the camera first. He covered the lens. Then he began pouring a liquid across the entrance to the house, across the porch surface, across the front door, and the area surrounding it. The quantity of the pour and the deliberateness of it told Sanders what it was before the flame appeared. The man produced a means of ignition and used it. The front of William Sanders's house caught fire on the screen of his phone while he stood wherever he was standing in Surprise, Arizona, On December 22, 2022, 3 days before Christmas. Sanders described his reaction in terms that anyone who has tried to compress a genuinely shocking experience into a word or two will recognize. He said "Holy something" and stared at the screen. The internal accounting that the brain performs in the first seconds of an unexpected catastrophe, the rapid sequencing through what is happening and what it means and what can be done about it, is not a process that produces full sentences at speed. It produces fragments. Sanders was looking at his house. His house was on fire. He was not there. Someone had set it. A neighbor saw the smoke. Smoke in a residential neighborhood on a still December afternoon travels horizontally before it rises, hugging the ground in the particular way of a fire that has not yet found enough oxygen to climb. The neighbor reached the source before the fire had moved beyond the porch area. They connected a garden hose and trained the water on the doorframe and the surrounding structure. The intervention was fast enough. The fire was brought under control before it could spread to the body of the house or climb into the roof structure, where it would have moved quickly through the framing materials and been considerably more difficult to address with a garden hose. What remained when the water had done its work was damage concentrated at the entrance, a front door that was charred through the paint and the outer surface of the wood, a welcome mat that had burned entirely, shingle ends above the doorframe that had caught enough heat to show clear fire marks, and the Ring doorbell camera itself, mounted beside the door, which had been in the heat long enough that the physical unit was no longer operational. The camera was destroyed. The footage was not. This is the specific feature of cloud-based recording systems that the Windjam case illustrates more clearly than almost any other incident in this script, because in this case, the physical destruction of the recording device was not incidental to the crime, but directly caused by it. The fire that Windjam set burned the camera. The footage that camera had generated in the minutes before and during the fire was already in cloud storage, uploaded in real time as the camera transmitted it, before the device reached the temperature at which it stopped functioning. Cloud transmission in doorbell systems does not wait for the event to conclude before archiving. It archives continuously, sending footage to remote servers as it is generated, which means that the physical fate of the device after the recording ends is irrelevant to the preservation of the footage. Windjam had covered the lens before pouring the accelerant, which was the correct intuition if the goal was to prevent documentation. Covering the lens did prevent the camera from capturing what happened behind the cover. It did not prevent the camera from having already captured his arrival, his approach to the lens, and the act of covering it, all of which were transmitted and stored before his hand reached the device. Arson investigation is among the most technically demanding categories of criminal investigation, and the reason is specific to the nature of fire as a medium. Fire is both the act of destruction and the means of its own concealment. A fire set deliberately burns the evidence of how it was started as it moves outward from the ignition point. The accelerant that produced the initial burn often burns itself. The point where the flame first appeared is typically the most damaged area of the scene, meaning that the location most relevant to establishing how the fire started is also the location where physical evidence has been most thoroughly consumed. Witnesses are rare because fires set deliberately are set when no one is present to observe, and an arsonist who has done any thinking about the act will choose a time and location that minimizes the chance of being seen. The combination of these factors has historically made arson among the most difficult serious crimes to prosecute. Conviction rates for arson lag substantially behind those for other violent and property crimes of comparable severity. Fire investigators who arrived at Sanders's property on Greenway Road found the physical aftermath of a porch fire consistent with an accelerant-initiated burn. The pattern of damage across the entrance area told them something about where the accelerant had been distributed and approximately how much had been used, because accelerant fires burn differently from fires that originate in a household material, and they leave characteristic damage patterns in the surfaces they touch. Investigators removed a section of the welcome mat. The mat's synthetic fibers had absorbed enough of the poured liquid before burning to preserve a testable sample within the remaining material. The square cut from the mat was sent for laboratory analysis to identify the specific accelerant compound. The Surprise Police Department released images from the doorbell footage to the public in the days following the fire. The images were specific enough for identification purposes. A man in a red hoodie, visible from multiple angles during his time on the porch. His face captured before and after the lens was covered. The distinctive color and cut of the garment providing a consistent identifying detail across the frames. The department shared these images through standard channels and through the community platforms that Ring and similar companies operate as adjuncts to their camera products. The Neighbors application, which Ring runs as a neighborhood safety and information forum, allows participating residents to share footage and alerts directly with each other and with local law enforcement agencies that have signed on to the platform. The images of the man in the red hoodie circulated through those channels and through local news coverage simultaneously. The tips that identified Justin Windham came from people who saw the released images and recognized the face or the hoodie or some combination of details that connected the footage to a name they knew. Windham was 36 years old and from the Roseville area in the greater Phoenix metropolitan region. The identification process moved quickly enough that by December 29th, 7 days after the fire, surprise police had arrested him. He was booked into the Maricopa County Jail on 2 charges: arson of an occupied structure and criminal damage. The arson charge was the more serious of the two. Arizona's arson statute classifies fires set in occupied structures at a higher level of severity than fires set in unoccupied ones, reflecting the legislative judgment that a residential building, even when no one happens to be physically present at the moment the fire is set, carries an elevated risk to human life because of the nature of how such buildings are used. A house is a place where people sleep, where their presence at any given hour is a reasonable expectation. The charge reflected that expectation, even though Sanders had been elsewhere when Windham arrived. No public motive was established. Sanders told reporters his feeling was that Windham had the wrong address, that whatever purpose had brought a man to a porch with a container of accelerant 3 days before Christmas had been directed at some other house on some other block, for reasons that had nothing to do with Sanders or anyone connected to him. The wrong house framing provides a kind of explanation while leaving intact the essential arbitrariness of the harm. If the address was an error, then the targeting logic that produced the fire cannot be reconstructed from anything about Sanders's life or history, because it was not pointed at his life or history. The fire was meant for somewhere else and arrived at his door through a navigational mistake of some kind. And the welcome mat that investigators later cut a square from had been sitting at the entrance of a house that was not the intended destination. Sanders's account of watching the fire on his phone while standing at a distance that made any physical intervention impossible describes an experience that the proliferation of residential camera technology has made newly possible and for which no prior framework of preparation exists. People have long received bad news at a distance, have long learned that something terrible was happening somewhere they could not reach. What doorbell cameras introduce is a specific variation on that experience. The homeowner is not being told about the event after it has concluded. They are watching it happen. The live feed is live. The fire on the screen is the fire on the porch. Present tense, active, visible in the specific resolution of a doorbell camera lens, at whatever distance the field of view encompasses. Sanders could see the shape of the flames. He could see the door. He could see the porch he walked across every day, reduced to a burning surface, while he looked at his phone from wherever he was standing, in Surprise, Arizona. The neighbor who moved toward the smoke with a garden hose did not have a screen showing them what was happening. They looked out of a window or stepped outside and saw smoke in the afternoon air and moved toward it with what was available. The garden hose was connected to an outdoor spigot on a property adjacent to Sanders's. The distance between the spigot and the burning porch was short enough that the hose reached. The neighbor pointed it at the flames and kept it there. These facts, the hose and the neighbor, and the shortness of the distance, and the decision to move toward the smoke rather than away from it, are what produced an outcome in which the house still stood when investigators arrived to take their samples. The footage from the destroyed camera, preserved in cloud storage and available to investigators within hours of the fire being reported, was sufficient to identify a suspect within 7 days and produce an arrest before the year was out. The physical device that generated that footage was a burned housing of plastic and circuitry mounted beside a charred doorframe. The record it had produced survived it entirely, held in servers somewhere remote from the porch, indifferent to the temperature that had ended the camera's operational life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves to Sacramento County, California, in the spring of 2026, where doorbell cameras across a residential neighborhood recorded a man approaching homes with a knife and making stabbing motions at front doors. Section 8. Brian Matson. Rebecca Breen was watching television when her phone sent the alert. The Ring camera at her front door on La Sierra Drive in Sacramento County's Arden neighborhood had detected motion, which in the experience of most doorbell camera owners means a delivery driver or a neighbor's dog or a gust of wind moving through a plant near the lens. She opened the feed. A man was standing at her front door holding a knife. As she watched, he raised it and made repeated stabbing motions toward the entrance. Then the pounding started, coming through the front of the house, physical and immediate. while she sat inside watching the same event on a screen in her hand. Breen later described watching through the live feed while simultaneously hearing the pounding as absolutely terrifying, a word she delivered without apparent exaggeration, in the specific flat tone of someone reporting an accurate emotional fact rather than reaching for emphasis. The camera and the door were showing and transmitting the same event from two different positions. The man with the knife was on her porch and on her phone at the same time, and she had no way to close the distance between those two versions of his presence. This was the evening of April 30th, 2026, a Wednesday, in the Arden neighborhood of unincorporated Sacramento County. Arden sits between the city of Sacramento to the south and the American River to the north, a mid-century residential area developed primarily in the post-war decades, when the state capital's population expanded outward from its downtown grid. The streets are lined with mature trees. The homes are mostly single-story and set back from the road. It is the kind of established neighborhood where people have lived in the same house for 20 or 30 years, where an unfamiliar figure moving between houses on a weeknight evening registers quickly against the baseline of what the street normally contains. Brian Matson was 56 years old. He was, over the course of that Wednesday evening, moving on foot through the residential streets of the Arden neighborhood, approaching front doors and performing at each one the behavior that multiple doorbell cameras across multiple homes captured with the consistent detail that comes from a network of devices positioned at eye level beside every entrance. The footage from each camera was not identical. Matson was at a different address in each clip, captured from a different angle by a device belonging to a different family, with no connection to any other family whose camera had also recorded him. The clips became significant, as a collective, precisely because of that independence. Each camera was a private device recording a private address. Together, assembled by investigators in the hours following the incident, they described something no single device could have shown alone: a path through the neighborhood, a man in transit between houses, the consistent behavior at each door forming a pattern across time and geography that the individual clips, viewed separately, could only suggest. Sacramento County Sheriff's Lieutenant Amar Gandhi coordinated the response that evening and later described the situation to reporters. Multiple residents across the neighborhood had called 911 within a short window of time. Several mentioned their Ring cameras explicitly as the source of what they were seeing, a detail that reflects how thoroughly the alert-then-check reflex has become integrated into the experience of noticing something wrong at a residential property. The deputies dispatched to La Sierra Drive and the surrounding area arrived within minutes. Gandhi acknowledged the speed of the response and then immediately qualified it. Matson was gone by the time units reached the area. The sheriff's office deployed a helicopter to extend the search into the surrounding blocks from above. The aerial asset covered the neighborhood and found nothing. He had moved fast enough or found cover quickly enough that neither the ground teams nor the aviation asset located him that evening. The investigation that followed used the footage from across the neighborhood's camera network to identify Matson. He was located the following morning, May 1, and arrested without resistance, without a physical struggle, without any attempt to flee. He was taken in and processed. The arrest report recorded the situation in the terms appropriate to an apprehension that produced no injuries and required no force. Then the charging problem emerged. California's statutes address the brandishing of a weapon in provisions that share a common requirement. The act must occur in the presence of another person in a manner that causes that person to fear immediate bodily harm, or in a rude, angry, or threatening manner in the presence of another person. The operative word in each version of that requirement is presence. The homeowners who had watched Matson through their cameras were not outside their homes. They were inside, separated from him by doors and walls, observing through applications on their phones. The footage documented the knife and the stabbing motions with clarity sufficient for a conviction in any number of other jurisdictions and any number of other legal frameworks. What it did not document, in the specific technical sense the California statute requires, was an encounter between Matson and another person in the open. He had been at the doors. The people behind the doors had watched through cameras. The legal question of whether that constituted the required presence received a prosecutorial answer that was either no or not clearly enough to support a charge that would survive review. The ceiling that remained available was criminal trespass, a misdemeanor. California's trespass statute is graduated, with more serious forms carrying enhanced penalties under specific aggravating circumstances. The conduct of April 30 on La Sierra Drive did not satisfy the elements needed to elevate the charge beyond the misdemeanor level. The documentation of what had happened was thorough. The legal instrument available to address what had happened was not. The probation hold was the secondary mechanism. Matson was on felony probation at the time of the arrest. A person on active felony probation who is arrested for new conduct can, in certain circumstances, be held on a probation hold, while the supervising authority determines whether the new behavior constitutes a violation of the probation terms. A hold of this kind operates independently of the bail process and independently of the severity of the new charge. It is a mechanism specifically designed to allow the system to retain custody of someone whose prior conviction history is now being supplemented by new documented conduct, while that history and the new conduct are evaluated together. The Sacramento County Probation Department was contacted following Matson's booking and asked to place a hold. The department declined. Without a probation hold, and with only the misdemeanor trespass charge driving the process, the legal track that governed Matson's situation after booking ran to its conclusion in under 2 hours. He was processed and released. The footage of what he had done across the Arden neighborhood on Wednesday evening existed in cloud storage, time-stamped and intact, and the man in that footage was back outside within 2 hours of being booked. The formal statement that the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office released addressed this outcome with a precision that reflected both the department's frustration and its institutional obligation to describe events accurately. The statement documented what the department had done at each step, identified the suspect through footage and investigation, arrested him without incident, pursued the charges the law supported, requested the probation hold. It then documented what had happened at each of those steps. The charge ceiling produced a misdemeanor. The hold request was declined. The release followed. The statement did not offer a justification for the outcome because the outcome was not the department's to justify. It had been produced by the intersection of two separate institutional decisions: the prosecutorial assessment of available charges and the probation department's decision on the hold request, neither of which belonged to the arresting agency. The community response moved through the platforms that residential camera networks generate as social infrastructure: the Ring Neighbors application, neighborhood Facebook groups, local news comment sections, and the direct message threads of people who had seen the footage and were passing it to people who had not. The Neighbors application in particular functions as a broadcast channel for exactly this kind of footage, allowing residents to share clips and information directly with each other and with participating law enforcement agencies. And the images of Matson moving through the Arden neighborhood had circulated across that platform before his name was publicly released. When the arrest was announced, the response was immediate. When the release was announced, the response was something different. Breen's framing of the incident, when she spoke to reporters in the aftermath, cut against the instinct to find comfort in randomness. She said she believed her family had been a random target and that the randomness was the more frightening conclusion, not the less frightening one. A targeted attack has a connecting logic between the attacker and the specific people harmed. That logic, however wrong, implies that people who do not share those specific characteristics are in a different category of risk. A random attack has no such anchor. The selection principle, if there is one, is not legible to the people trying to understand why it came to their door. She said, if it was not her family, it was going to be someone else. She was correct about the timeline, if not the specific address. Within hours of Matson's release from the jail, Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies responded to a report from a business near Fair Oaks Boulevard and San Lucas Way, a commercial area a short distance from the Arden neighborhood. The report described conduct consistent with what the cameras had documented on Wednesday evening. Matson was at the location. He was rearrested. The second arrest was processed before the working day ended, which meant that within a single operational cycle, the same individual had been identified through camera footage, arrested, processed, released, and arrested again at another address. Gandhi's summary of the overall situation held the two parts of the outcome in the same account without allowing either to cancel the other. He described the behavior across the Arden neighborhood as genuinely frightening, the kind of conduct that produces serious consequences when it encounters a door that opens. He then described what had prevented that outcome. Residents had seen what the cameras were showing them, had stayed inside, had locked their doors, had called for help promptly. The doors had held. No one had gone outside to see what the pounding was. Deputies had reached the area within minutes. The helicopter had been up, and the intersection of those responses, rather than the cameras alone, had produced an evening in which no one was physically harmed. The cameras had provided the documentation. They had done it in real time, across multiple devices, in sufficient resolution to support identification, with enough geographic spread to reconstruct a path through the neighborhood. They had transmitted and archived the footage before Matson left any individual porch, and before any of the homeowners watching through their phones had made their calls. The footage was there, intact and time-stamped, when investigators needed it the following morning. What the cameras had no mechanism to determine was which charges the documented conduct supported, or whether the probation authority would issue a hold, or what would happen in the 2 hours between booking and release. The footage documented what Matson did on La Sierra Drive. The legal and institutional framework that processed the documentation of what he did produced the outcome it produced. By the time he was back at a business on Fair Oaks Boulevard that same afternoon, the cameras at that location were also running. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section travels to Warren County in Pennsylvania in the summer of 2023, where a man who had already been accused of murder escaped from a county jail and disappeared into the surrounding countryside. Section 9. Michael Burham. Michael Charles Burham used a piece of exercise equipment in the recreation yard of the Warren County Jail to elevate himself high enough to reach the roof on the night of July 6, 2023. He had knotted bedsheets into a length sufficient to lower himself down the exterior wall on the far side. He came down wearing an orange and white striped inmate jumpsuit, a denim jacket, and a pair of Crocs, and he walked away from the building into the surrounding Pennsylvania landscape. By the time staff conducted a routine check the following morning and found the yard empty, he had been gone long enough that the distance between him and the jail already required a serious answer. Warren is a small city of roughly 9,000 people at the northern edge of Pennsylvania, where the Allegheny River bends through a narrow valley that the surrounding terrain closes in on from both sides. The city is the county seat of Warren County, a jurisdiction that extends southward into the Allegheny National Forest, one of the largest blocks of public forest in the eastern United States. The National Forest covers more than 500,000 acres of dense hardwood terrain, a landscape of ridgelines and ravines, river valleys, and secondary growth timber that has been regenerating since the logging era of the late 19th century left the hills stripped and the watershed degraded. What grew back is thick and varied and, in July, fully leafed out into the kind of canopy cover that makes aerial observation difficult and ground movement slow. The forest is not uninhabited in the sense of being remote from all human presence. There are roads through it and campsites in it, and people who use it regularly throughout the warmer months for hunting and fishing and recreation. But it is large enough that a person who moves through it deliberately, away from the trails and the established camping areas, can put themselves in terrain that organized search parties will spend days covering, without certainty of having covered it completely. Burham had thought about this. Investigators established in the days following his escape that he had done more than think about it. Small stockpiles of supplies were found in wooded areas during the search, positioned in locations that suggested they had been placed there before July 6. Improvised campsites were discovered in the forest, again at points that indicated prior preparation, rather than opportunistic improvisation after the fact. He had not gone over the wall hoping for the best. He had arranged, before he arranged the bedsheets, for there to be something waiting for him on the other side of the search zone. The planning implied a timeline, a set of decisions made over a period of weeks or months while he was still inside, a man calculating the distance between himself and the forest, and working backward from the forest to the yard. Pennsylvania State Police Lieutenant Colonel George Bivens was the primary public voice of the law enforcement response in the days that followed, holding news conferences that served the dual function of updating the public and managing the investigative challenge of communicating enough information to generate useful tips without providing so much operational detail that a fugitive with access to news coverage could read the updates and adjust accordingly. Bivens described Burham in terms that the investigative profile supported: a self-taught survivalist with military reserve experience. The military background was specific. Burham had served in the reserves in a capacity that developed relevant practical skills, the kind of skills that connect to navigation and fieldcraft, and the ability to sustain oneself in austere conditions for extended periods. These were not vague generalities about a person who liked camping. They were documented capabilities in a man who had, at some point prior to his incarceration, demonstrated them over more than 2 months of unassisted backcountry living. Bivens also told reporters that based on his prior criminal history, Burham might have access to a firearm. He was considered armed and dangerous. The charges that had produced his $1 million bail were serious, across multiple jurisdictions, and multiple categories of offense. He was being held on arson and burglary charges in Pennsylvania. He was a named suspect in the death of Kala Hodgkin, 34 years old, in Jamestown, New York, across the state line, where the Jamestown Police Department had announced his connection to her murder in early May and offered a reward for information leading to his arrest. He was also linked to an incident from earlier in May in which he had taken a Warren County couple against their will, driven them across several states to South Carolina, and then released them. The combination of a homicide investigation, a kidnapping case, and the arson and burglary charges that had placed him in the Warren County Jail constituted a legal situation of considerable weight, and the bail figure reflected the court's assessment of how seriously to take the risk of him remaining free. The multi-agency search that assembled in the hours following the discovery of his absence drew resources from local, state, and federal levels. Pennsylvania State Police coordinated with the United States Marshals Service, which deployed assets specifically trained in fugitive recovery. The search spread outward from the jail in a pattern that took into account everything investigators knew about Burham's likely capabilities and likely direction. Aerial assets operated over the forest and the surrounding rural county. Ground teams moved along ridgelines and through valley bottoms. Canine units worked the perimeter. The search was large, organized, and well-resourced, and Burham was not in it. The doorbell camera that caught him operated in a residential neighborhood south of the city of Warren at approximately 5 in the morning. The resident whose camera recorded the footage saw the alert, reviewed the clip, and contacted authorities. Bivens confirmed the sighting at a news conference without specifying the exact location, beyond describing it as south of Warren. He confirmed that the footage had been taken within the preceding couple of days, declining to be more precise. The clip showed a man matching Burham's description moving through the pre-dawn hours of a summer morning in the direction of the woods. He was walking toward the trees. He was not running. He moved at the pace of someone with a destination and the knowledge of how to reach it. Bivens used the doorbell camera sighting as the basis for a specific public request. He asked residents across northwestern Pennsylvania and into western New York to review their own doorbell and surveillance footage. Not just the live feed or the most recent alert, but the accumulated recorded clips from the preceding days and nights. A man moving through residential areas adjacent to the forest would most likely do so during the hours of least human activity. The hours between midnight and first light, when the streets are empty and the houses are dark and the doorbell cameras are running on motion detection, sending alerts to phones that their owners may not check until morning. The footage was there in the cloud storage attached to those accounts. The request was for people to go back and look at what their cameras had already captured without anyone having specifically looked for it. The logic behind that request reflected something the search teams already understood practically. Burham was not crossing major roads in daylight. He was not approaching convenience stores or gas stations. He was moving through the edges of residential areas at the hours when surveillance of any kind, human or electronic, was at its thinnest. The doorbell camera network that had accumulated across those residential areas was not a coordinated system. It was the aggregate of individual purchasing decisions. But its practical coverage, across a community where a significant proportion of homes had installed these devices over the preceding decade, was dense enough that a person moving through a neighborhood at 3 or 4 in the morning would pass in front of several of them between one woodline and the next. The question was whether anyone had thought to look at what those cameras had recorded during the hours in question. On July 5th, 9 days into the search, a family camping in the Bear Creek area of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho reported seeing a man whose description was consistent with Burham's. They described a white male with a long ponytail and an overgrown beard, carrying a black backpack, wearing a black cap and dark shorts. The United States Marshals Greater Idaho Fugitive Task Force investigated the tip. The geographic distance between Warren County, Pennsylvania, and the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho is substantial, more than 2,000 miles of direct line, and the timeline of travel would have required either assistance or transportation resources that investigators had not established Burham possessed. The tip was pursued and did not produce an apprehension. The actual end of the search was produced by a dog on the afternoon of July 15th in Conewango Township in the rural county south of Warren. A homeowner and his wife were in a golf cart when the dog's barking drew them toward the back of their property. What they found there was a man who had made a camp on their land. Bivens later described the exchange that followed in the compressed terms of someone reporting a set of facts that needed no elaboration to convey their weight. A brief conversation took place. The man offered an explanation involving camping. The homeowner, who had been following the news coverage for 9 days, recognized the face. He did not extend the conversation. He got his wife back into the golf cart, turned it toward the house, and drove far enough away from the man in the back of the property to make his phone call, without the man being able to hear what he said. As the homeowner drove and then called, Burham moved back into the trees. What the homeowner did in those minutes represents a specific kind of composure that is easier to describe after the fact than to maintain in the moment. He had come around to the back of his own land, expecting to find whatever had disturbed his dog, a deer or a raccoon, or a neighbor's animal that had wandered through the fence line. He found instead a man who had been the subject of a 9-day regional manhunt, a man connected to multiple serious crimes across 2 states, a man whom law enforcement had described publicly as potentially armed and dangerous. He maintained enough external calm during the conversation that Burham apparently did not register that he had been recognized. He prioritized getting his wife away from the situation before doing anything else. And then he made the call that brought the search to a point where the outcome was no longer in doubt. Pennsylvania State Police, the United States Marshals, and United States Border Patrol agents moved into the area and established a perimeter around the wooded ground into which Burham had retreated. Canine units were deployed into the trees. Aviation assets provided overhead coverage of the terrain. The tracking took approximately 2 hours from the time of the homeowner's call to the moment Burham was taken into custody. He was found in the woods and surrounded by the closing perimeter of officers and handlers and dogs. He was apprehended at approximately 10 minutes before 6 in the evening, a little under 9 full days after he had climbed over the wall of the recreation yard in the pre-dawn hours of July 7. His physical condition when officers reached him was described as fatigued. He was still wearing the prison pants from his original jumpsuit. He had discarded or lost the denim jacket at some point during the 9 days. He was not carrying a firearm. He did not resist. The men and women who had been searching the Allegheny terrain for more than a week brought him out of the woods in the late afternoon light of a July Saturday and processed him at the state police station in Warren County, with Bivens at the news conference that evening noting simply that a determination would be made about where he would ultimately be housed, because he would not be returning to the Warren County Jail. The legal proceedings that followed were handled across 2 jurisdictions. Burham pleaded guilty in November 2023 to charges in both the Pennsylvania escape and the Pennsylvania kidnapping case. In January 2024, he was sentenced to a combined term of 25 years and 2 months to 50 years and 4 months in Pennsylvania custody. The kidnapping of the Warren County couple who had been driven to South Carolina and released formed the basis of the longer portion of that sentence. The escape itself produced a separate sentence of 3.5 to 7 years, subsumed within the larger total. He was subsequently transferred to New York, where Chautauqua County Judge Foley presided over proceedings related to the death of Kala Hodgkin. Burham had pleaded guilty to her shooting death. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole upon completion of the Pennsylvania sentence. The aggregate of what he faced across both states placed the earliest possible date of any parole consideration well into his later decades. The doorbell camera that had caught him walking toward the woods south of Warren at 5 in the morning had done the thing that doorbell cameras do. It had recorded motion at the edge of a residential property during the hours when no one was awake to observe it, stored the footage in cloud storage, and made it available to the homeowner when they checked their alerts. The footage had confirmed that Burham was still in the area and still moving in a consistent direction. It had been used in a news conference to demonstrate to the public that the search had produced a confirmed sighting and to prompt further reviews of similar footage across the region. It had not ended the search. That was done by a dog in the afternoon and a homeowner in a golf cart who recognized a face and kept his composure long enough to get his wife clear before he made a call. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final section moves to Savannah, Georgia, in January 2026. A woman saw a figure on her doorbell camera late at night, standing outside her apartment wearing a ski mask. Within days of that report becoming public, dozens of calls came in from women across the city who recognized the footage. Section 10. Nathaniel Crawford. An elderly resident of an apartment complex in Savannah, Georgia, walked into the Chatham County Sheriff's Office in January 2026 and asked to speak with Sheriff Richard Coleman directly. She had been documenting what was happening to her, keeping written notes, recording dates and details of each incident, and she presented that organized record to him in person. Coleman described her afterward in specific terms. A true champ, he said. She had her notations. Her account, precise and brought forward without hesitation, gave the Special Investigations Unit the starting point that led within days to the arrest of Nathaniel Crawford and the discovery that the incidents she had documented were one thread in a pattern that had been moving through the city's south side for weeks, captured on cameras at multiple addresses whose owners had no idea any of the others existed. What she reported was harassment at her home. The nature of it, and the footage that investigators subsequently obtained from cameras at the apartment complex, showed a man approaching the property and attempting to reach her. The footage also showed him in a ski mask. That detail matters for a specific investigative reason, beyond the obvious one. A person who wears a mask while approaching a residential address has made a decision before arriving. They have thought about what they are doing, prepared for it, and chosen to make it harder for anyone at the address to identify them. The mask is not incidental. It is a piece of planning. Nathaniel Crawford was 24 years old and had been living in Savannah when the Chatham County Sheriff's Office Special Investigations Unit arrested him on the evening of January 27, 2026. The charges filed against him were criminal attempt at kidnapping, stalking, and criminal trespass. Chatham County Sheriff's Office classified the case, from the beginning, as a stranger-on-stranger incident. That classification carries specific weight in the vocabulary of law enforcement and crime reporting. It means the victims and the suspect did not know each other. It means there was no prior relationship, no domestic history, no shared circle of acquaintances, no prior contact that would explain why this particular man was at these particular addresses. He had selected his victims from among strangers, which placed the case in a category that is both rarer and harder to contain than domestic stalking, because the logic of selection is not anchored to anything traceable through personal history. Crawford's personal history before the arrest was documented and serious. In 2023, on April 15th, he had pointed a gun at 3 women and threatened them with death, according to court records. On the same day, in what the records indicate was a connected incident, he had pointed the same weapon at 3 children and threatened them as well. Those acts produced charges that included 3 counts of aggravated assault, cruelty to children, and possession of a firearm during the commission of or attempt to commit certain felonies. He had served time at Coastal State Prison and had been released in 2024, after less than 2 full years of a 10-year sentence. He was on parole when the Savannah investigation began. The geography of his activity, as investigators reconstructed it, was concentrated in a specific part of Savannah's south side. The area around the View at Oglethorpe Apartments, Wheaton Street, Randolph Street, and the Middle Ground Road corridor formed the primary zone that the Special Investigations Unit focused on as the case expanded. The investigator who spoke to local media about the pattern of Crawford's behavior described it in terms that reflected a deliberate operational method rather than random opportunism. He would pick his target in these areas. The language implies selection, evaluation, a process of identifying a specific person and then directing sustained attention toward them across multiple encounters and locations. One of the confirmed victims had an altercation with Crawford at a Family Dollar store on Wheaton Street. He prevented her from getting into her vehicle. The circumstances of how that encounter developed, and what Crawford said or did during it, are not fully detailed in the public record, but the outcome is, the woman was able to break free and get away from him. She later identified Crawford as the person responsible to law enforcement, and that identification was one of the pieces that investigators used to build the case that led to the January 27th arrest. The footage that was obtained from cameras at the View at Oglethorpe and from surrounding locations showed Crawford outside apartment buildings in the ski mask. It showed him attempting to reach women who were inside their units. The footage that WeSav obtained and reported on included a clip from the apartment complex in which Crawford is visible in the mask, engaged in behavior that investigators described as an attempt to get to the woman living there. The footage was not ambiguous about what it showed. A masked man at the entrance to a residential building, oriented toward a specific unit, attempting to close the distance between himself and a woman on the other side of a door. After Crawford's arrest was made public, the phone calls began. Dozens of them, according to investigators. The calls came from people across the Savannah area who had encountered Crawford and had not known, until his name and face were released by the sheriff's office, that the person they had encountered was the same person others had also encountered, that the incidents they had experienced were not isolated events, but part of a pattern, that what had felt singular and inexplicable to each of them was in fact the visible surface of a course of conduct that had been moving through the south side of Savannah for weeks. 6 victims were formally identified in the immediate aftermath of the arrest. Investigators said publicly and explicitly that they believed the actual number of victims was higher. The focus of the ongoing investigation on Middle Ground Road and surrounding areas reflected the working assumption that there were women in those neighborhoods who had experienced something and had not yet come forward, either because they had not seen the coverage of Crawford's arrest or because they had seen it and had reason to hesitate before placing a call. Many of the victims who were identified declined to speak publicly. The investigators who spoke on their behalf noted that the common thread across those conversations was that the victims had not expected what happened to them, had not believed, before it occurred, that they were the kind of people to whom this kind of thing happened. This is a specific observation and worth holding for a moment. Every victim involved in this case, in the formulation that investigator Trey Connors used when speaking to reporters, did not think it would happen to them. The statement is not a criticism of the victim's judgment or an assessment of their awareness. It is a description of something true about how most people move through residential areas and commercial spaces in their daily lives. The baseline assumption is safety. The adjustment to that assumption happens after something disrupts it. What Crawford's activity across the south side of Savannah produced was a retroactive disruption of the baseline assumption for a significant number of women who had each, separately, experienced something alarming and had each processed it in the context of their own individual life without knowing it was part of a larger thing. The doorbell camera footage and the surveillance footage from the apartment complex and from Oglethorpe Mall provided the connective tissue that made the larger thing visible. At the mall, on January 12th, footage showed Crawford outside a store before its opening hours, pacing in front of the windows. He was attempting to get to the clerk he could see inside. He eventually directed a series of lewd comments at her through the glass. He was wearing, investigators noted, the same shirt he had worn in the footage from The View at Oglethorpe Apartments. The shirt was a detail that connected a mall surveillance clip to an apartment complex clip that might otherwise have been treated as unrelated incidents at different locations on different dates. Within the same mall, on the same day or approximate day, he had a second encounter with a different woman, this time inside a store, where he found her in a back area and directed comments at her that caused her to fear for her safety. Investigators described the arc of Crawford's activity in the weeks before his arrest as escalating. The word is used in assessments of this kind with a specific meaning. The behavior was becoming more direct, more physically proximate, more oriented toward contact rather than observation. The incidents at the mall represented a more aggressive phase than the behavior at the apartment complex. The Family Dollar altercation, in which he physically blocked a woman from reaching her car, represented a further step. The trajectory that investigators were tracking was not a stable one. The arrest happened within hours of the decision to make the search for Crawford public. The speed of that outcome, from the moment investigators went public to the moment Crawford was in custody, reflected both the intensity of the search and the fact that he was operating in a specific geographic area that investigators had already mapped in some detail. He was taken into custody on the evening of January 27th. He was held without bond. At his preliminary hearing on February 24th, a judge reviewed the evidence and sent the case to Superior Court. His parole from the prior aggravated assault conviction was expected to be revoked, meaning the time remaining on that sentence would become relevant to his total period of incarceration, independent of what the new charges produced. The investigation did not stop with Crawford's arrest. Surveillance footage from The View at Oglethorpe had also captured a second man, whose identity investigators were seeking publicly in the days following January 27th. That second suspect had been identified through victim interviews and through the footage itself. A third possible suspect was identified through reports of a separate incident in East Savannah, where a man was seen on camera, confronting a woman and allegedly attempting to take her. Investigators believed this third person had been seen with Crawford in commercial settings on prior occasions. The case had begun with a single elderly resident's detailed account and a set of doorbell camera clips from one apartment complex, and it had expanded into a multi-suspect investigation covering significant portions of the city's south side. What the camera footage did in the Crawford investigation was provide a mechanism for connecting incidents that each victim had experienced in isolation. A woman who had been approached at her apartment building by a masked man and who had not known whether the experience would ever be taken seriously or whether the man had targeted anyone else, now had a name, an arrest, and a case number. A woman who had been followed to her car at a Family Dollar and had managed to get away could see in the footage circulating after the arrest that the person she had encountered was the same person whose face was now in the news. The footage did not change what had happened to any of them. It made the pattern of what had happened legible, visible, connectable, in a way that the isolated individual experience of each incident had not been. Savannah Mayor Van Johnson addressed the case in terms that oriented around the moment before the crime rather than the moment after it. He said the city needed people to come forward beforehand. He acknowledged that coming forward after the fact helps with prosecution, but his emphasis was on the value of reporting something before it reaches the level at which a criminal charge becomes the primary vehicle for addressing it. The logic is clear, and the gap it identifies is real. The doorbell cameras and the apartment complex surveillance system had documented Crawford's behavior across multiple locations over multiple weeks. The footage existed. What had taken time was assembling it into a picture that connected the dots between incidents that had each been processed in isolation. Crawford had moved through the south side of Savannah for weeks before an elderly woman at The View at Oglethorpe sat down with the sheriff and showed him her notes. She had documented what was happening. She had written things down, kept track of dates and details, preserved the account with the kind of care that produces an investigation. In a case built substantially on camera footage, on clips from doorbell devices and apartment complex systems that had been running continuously and recording whatever moved in front of them, it was the handwritten record of one resident who had decided to go directly to the person in charge and ask for help that produced the arrest within hours of the search being made public. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.